Uh, I'm going to assume, because you're a diverse group, that I'm not going to do the ABCs, but I'm going to try and explain things without the presumption that people really are familiar with Arendt. I'm just curious how many people are, just raise your hand, familiar with any of the writings. Okay, just a couple, so that's good. You can help the thing. I know that, I mean, what Andrew said is, I mean, this title of your course and your seminars has socialism in it. Arendt was not really very sympathetic with socialism. I want to read the first paragraph. On the other hand, I'm going to focus primarily and use it as a rubric for bringing in a number of her ideas on her very distinctive conception of revolution. And I'll try to present it in a way without necessarily developing critiques of it, but at least you see the areas where people can discuss it. Because like so much of Arendt's writing, it really is extraordinarily distinctive in her thinking. So the main text, although I will be referring to other texts, is the book on revolution. But I thought I should read to you the first paragraph of the way in which she begins this book, where this is what she has to say. This is the beginning of her introduction. She says, wars and revolution, as though events had only hurried up to fulfill Lenin's early prediction, have thus far determined the physiognomy of the 20th century, and as distinguished from 19th century ideologies such as nationalism, internationalism, capitalism, and imperialism, socialism, and communism, which, though still invoked by many as justified causes, have lost contact with the major realities of our world. So Arendt is rather skeptical of traditional ideologies, although I think, as Andrew already alluded, there's plenty that she's got to say that I think is directly relevant to anybody who's trying to rethink socialism today. Now, in that same beginning and introduction, and this is something that she repeats over and over and over again, here's what she has to say about the aim of revolution. The aim of revolution, was and always has been freedom. And she will repeat this in many different ways. In fact, she will go on to say that the raison d'etre of politics itself is freedom. Now, in order to appreciate the significance of that remark, which is sometimes called the truism, one has to understand something which is very distinctive about Arendt's approach to freedom. The freedom that she's talking about when she talks about the aim of revolution is what she will call political freedom. And political freedom for her is something which is in fact, is absolutely distinct from what she calls the philosophical or the internal conception of freedom. And many people think, when they think about freedom, they think about the issue of free will versus determinism, how you can reconcile them or not. That is not primarily the concern at all. In fact, she's going to make the startling claim that public freedom existed before the philosophical freedom became really a problem, which he thinks only happened with Paul and St. Augustine. So what does she mean by political freedom? Now, for some of you who have read Arendt, you know that when she, in The Human Condition, she begins by speaking about the Greek polis. And there is a sense in which the Greek polis is always a kind of point of reference for her, although you're going to see that for her, political or public freedom is something that she sees was exhibited not only in the Greek polis, but in the American Revolution, the French Revolution. She sees it as in the Paris Commune, in the Soviets when they originally originally existed, the Rota when they existed in Germany, right up for her to the Hungarian Revolution. I think it's important to see that when Arendt is dealing with issues of the past, she's not interested in the past per se. She's interested in how it can illuminate what is taking place today. I mean, in her book called Between Past and Future, she says all thinking takes place in the gap between past and future. And it's as if what she is, when she's talking about public freedom, she'll sometimes speak of it as a kind of lost treasure, something where she's trying to recover so that we can today understand the significance of what is most important for her, which she's going to call the revolutionary spirit. So let me first begin by just talking a little bit about how she understands the Greek polis. And I don't really want to go into a whole set of distinctions between labor, work, and action. Action always has a distinctive meaning for Arendt. It doesn't mean what we ordinarily mean. Action is intrinsically for her political and involves a kind of plurality. So what is it that she's trying to evoke? She's trying to evoke the beginnings of what we still think of as Western democracy. And one of the most, I think, interesting, and I'm going to try and show you why I think it's one of the most interesting and important distinctions that Arendt wants to make is between what you will call sometimes liberty and freedom. Liberty for her is always liberty from. It can be the liberty from the necessity of having to engage in labor just to survive, which you call biological necessity. It can be the liberation from oppressive rulers. But liberty for her is always in that negative. It's liberty from, it is not yet freedom, public freedom. Freedom comes about in, now let me just begin with the Greeks, but then I'll move on to other things. In that kind of realm, that kind of public space in which people who have been freed from necessities are able to engage in deliberation, in discourse. For her, freedom and politics always involves for her, she says in the beginning of the human condition, that the condition for action is plurality. Plurality is one of the most essential themes in Arendt. Plurality means that we are many, that we are, she always used masculine pronouns, that we are men, human beings, not just single individuals. And the political realm, as she describes it, is something where we can appear in public with our peers, debate with them. One of the things that she emphasizes about what I'll call a positive sense of freedom and action, the dignity that she sees in it, is that freedom and politics demand equality, but not necessarily social equality or equality of opportunity. That's not what she's talking about. But it is a realm in which we are confronting others as our equals in terms of respect and discussing with them. What Arendt says about equality, equality in the political realm is not something that naturally exists. It's not God-given, and it's not that all men are created equal. It is something that is created when we create that kind of public space in which there can be deliberation and kind of discourse. What rules for her in the realm of politics or public freedom is persuasion. And it is the realm in which, in her sense of opinion, in which we, not our own individual, in which we are forming opinions, testing opinions. It's the realm of what the Greeks called doxa. She has a beef, this is a side issue, with political philosophy. She thinks that political philosophers, beginning with Plato, but earlier with Parmenides, have not really been interested in politics as per se, and not been interested in public freedom per se. They've been much more interested in looking at politics from the point of view of philosophy and opposing standards that she thinks are frequently foreign from politics. What she has in mind, of course, is the denigration of the Greeks of doxa, of opinion. But doxa and opinion is where public freedom manifests itself. Now, I quoted the passage in which I said that the aim of revolution is, for her, is freedom. And I think I could make a stronger sense. What she thinks takes place in a genuine revolution is not only the aim of it, but the exemplification. That's where, you might say, the various virtues of public discourse, of arguing with each other, of speaking to each other as equals, arises and manifests itself. And in the, I'm not going to go into a whole analysis of the modern world, because what she thinks that the distinctiveness of what she calls the political realm, the realm of action, the realm of plurality, the realm of deliberation and debate. She once says that debate is the quintessence of politics, that we've lost sight of it. And that what has began to take place over it is a concept of the social, which obliterates the distinctiveness of the political and the distinctiveness of the public and the private. And so she's rather critical of the consumer society, of administration, etc. You can get, sometimes there are phrases in Arendt that are really almost epitomize what she is getting at. Politics, for her, is the realm, and when I put the emphasis on politics, you might say as it once was, and as it has been in certain moments of history, and as it can be, is always the kind of positive term for her. Arendt is absolutely aware of politics that exists today. Remember that she's the one who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, but she knows full well about the dangers of what we sometimes today call politics, but she's always contrasting that with this other conception of what she takes to be politics and what she takes public freedom really to be. Now, I think it's important to see that on revolution, her book on revolution is a highly polemical book. It's a book which is contrasting the American Revolution with the French Revolution. Her view of the French Revolution is that it started off with many of the high ideals that we all find in the American Revolution, but as we all know, it ended in terror. And whereas the American Revolution for her ended in the formation and the creation and the ratification of the Constitution. And that's what she, in fact, she's very much aware of the what she considers a European prejudice, that the model for modern revolution is the French Revolution, and that has been the model for the revolution from the time of the French Revolution right up until the Russian Revolution. And that's the way people think of revolution, in a way in the from using the categories that she thinks were relevant to the French, but not the American. In fact, there are lots of people, Europeans, who think, well, America never really went for a revolution. Let me just say something that might sound startling, but it's absolutely fundamental for Arendt. I mean, when we think of revolution, I think without just, not coming at it from any point of view, we think about revolutionary violence. And that's what really revolutions involve. It will turn out for Arendt, violence is antithetical to revolution. And that genuine revolution does not involve violence at all. Now that sounds startling, but I'll try to explicate what it means for Arendt. Let me go back to the distinction between, I want to do this, make a backward reference and a forward reference to the distinction between liberty and freedom. What Americans call the revolution, she calls the war of liberation. I mean, that is the fighting of the British to, in a certain sort of way, to be rid of what at least those who in America took to be the tyranny of Great Britain over them. That for her is the war of liberation. Where freedom really began is in what almost immediately took place first in our colonies, constitution making. Meaning that this is something, I mean, of course, Andrew is the expert on this, but it was the process of developing constitutions that you really see what is quintessential for her about revolution. Revolution then is really starting something new, but creating, in this case, let me focus on the American Revolution, creating a new republic, a new world order that was, and her analysis of the American Revolution is that that in the among the colonies at that particular time, there were two advantages that Americans had that Europeans did not have. One advantage was that the problem, although she doesn't denigrate at all the significance of slavery, that the problem of the misery of poverty was not a primary issue for the American thinkers. And indeed, she's right that if we think of the non-slaves in America, you had nothing like the kind of poverty and misery that you had in France for it. We were lucky that way, that there was a more sense, even when you had rich and poor, privileged class and not, the difference is you had a kind of citizenship in the colonies at that time in which almost all people who had at least some property could vote and participate. The other thing that she thinks was an enormous advantage over the European model is that ever since the founding of the colonies, going all the way back to the Mayflower Compact, that you had a whole tradition of compacting, covenanting of self-government. Self-government was the primary mode of political activity in the colonies on a local level. I mean, even though they were governors, nevertheless, you had the independent legislators, etc. Now, let me continue with the American Revolution and then contrast it a little bit with the French Revolution. The so-called founding fathers, as we call them, were not originally revolutionaries. They were, that their main impetus, was really claiming their rights as Englishmen. They really felt they were going back to what was considered from the time of the Magna Carta, the rights of Englishmen, felt that this was being imposed upon by King George, and really wanted those rights, so that the idea of revolution was not in their mind at all. It's only from her point of view, in and through the process of the War of Liberation, that they began to develop a sense of their own, that they were in a position to create something new, something that had never existed before. They, even though they used the models from the Romans in the past, the Greeks and the Italians, a new kind of republic. She emphasizes something which for her was extremely important. Many people think that first of all, what was significant about the constituting is this. I mean, is the constituting, not the end product, the making of it. The constitut pouvoir is what she emphasized in this, so that constitution making for her came from below, not from top. She likes to quote Tom Paine, who said, a constitution is constituted by a people, not by a government. So that there is this, I tend to call it kind of radical bottom-up conception of Arendt, which becomes very important for her in a whole conception of the revolutionary spirit. And so she emphasizes it was not even just a writing of a document called the Constitution. In fact, when she deals with what she takes to be the failure of America, she thinks it happened after writing of the Constitution. It was that spirit that took place in these different assemblies. The fact that you had something which was, really, from a historical point, quite distinctive up until that time, that the document that was written in Philadelphia was not yet the Constitution. It was a proposal, and it had to be adopted by at least 9 states. And in each state, there were special assemblies in which all citizens can vote whether or not they want to accept it. So it really is something which is developed by the people. It's not just for the people, but it is of the people, and it was ratified by the people, at least those who were voting in the various kinds of states. And so from her perspective, they became, it's only gradually that the so-called founding fathers really became aware of their possibility of creating something new and a new kind of republic. Just to make just a quick reference to the French Revolution, she does think that the French Revolution began in the same way, with a concern with freedom, in her sense of public freedom, but that it very soon became abandoned because now in some ways it's very rough, because in France you had what she calls the social question, which you did not have in America. And by the social question, she means the misery of the poor. But once you once it became that the sans-culotte, those who were deprived, the miserable, were determining it, she thinks there's a certain logic that leads to, that led ultimately to terror. She's very skeptical of what she calls Vera's most compassion and pity. She thinks that those are not political. And when they begin, and when you get the kind of so-called compassion for the extreme poor, and that they should be able to do what they, from our point of view, what they want, you destroy the possibility of freedom. I don't want to endorse what she's saying, but that's the major contrast that she wants to draw. Now, let me come back. So from her point of view, this phase of American Constitution was the success of the revolution. Let me make a slight detour today, because so you'll see the kind of relevance that I think sometimes a distinction can have. I said that I think that one of the most interesting distinctions that she makes is between liberty and freedom. And it strikes me that this has enormous contemporary relevance, because let me just take an instance of America. When the administration, the Bush administration, was justifying the first intervention in Iraq, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the story, or one of the stories that were being told to the Americans, is that when Saddam Hussein is overthrown, then freedom will flourish, public freedom will flourish in Iraq and spread throughout the Middle East. This was the kind of rhetoric and propaganda at that time. And now we know how misguided that really was. Freedom, liberty may be a necessary condition for freedom and liberty from oppressors, but it is not in any ways a sufficient condition for the positive achievement of public freedom and freedom. So that's, in that sense, the distinction and the illusions. I mean, it also happened, I think, after the fall of the Berlin War in '89. There was a kind of enormous euphoria that freedom is now going to flourish throughout Eastern Europe and even the Soviet Union. And I think what we know in terms of the history of what's happened, that in terms of what Arendt means by public freedom, that's not something that has come to be at all. It's, I think we're constantly being obscured with these two notions that just overthrow the ruler and everything is going to be good. It's not that Arendt is against overthrowing tyrants and totalitarianism. That is the case, but the belief that that ushers in public freedom is an illusion, and an illusion that I think we suffer through over and over again. Now I want to talk to you about what she considers the failure of the American Revolution. The failure that she sees is the American Revolution, and this will bring us back to the revolutionary spirit, is that almost as soon as the Constitution became a written document, that there was a lack of memory of what was distinctive about the revolutionary spirit, the way in which Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and so forth interacted with each other. The distinctive flavor and spirit was forgotten. Sometimes she's going to call this the lost treasure, and then I'll show you some of its contemporary significance. And the second thing that she thinks was that where America failed, it failed to create those kinds of institutions in which public freedom could flourish. She thinks that the one person who had some insight into this problem was Jefferson, who really, at least after, was hoping that there would be little republics in which people could have this kind of confrontation, this kind of discussion, and so that spirit of it. I mean, what was originally an American institution of the town meeting, which was a kind of a self-legislation in which people could speak, test their opinions, and argue with each other, that the failure to create anything like that was a disaster, and a disaster which he thinks that America has been suffering from ever since. Okay. Now, it might sound as if, I mean, what I'm talking about in terms of her notions of freedom and revolution, well, revolution didn't apply to the Greeks, but public freedom was there. But it might sound as if this is only an 18th century phenomenon. Let me read another passage from Arendt, which shows Yeah. When she, in her book on Between Past and Future, the example she begins with of this manifestation of real freedom was the French resistance. And what she wants to single out in the French resistance was how almost spontaneously people gave up their own egoistic concerns and began to act together, began to create a space of public freedom. And what she also points out, she begins with a kind of quotation from René Schwarr, who was, after the war ended, was lamenting the fact that the liberation from the war meant that the kind of experience that was being exemplified in the actual resistance would itself disappear, and people would go back to their own kinds of petty concerns. So Arendt's view is that beginning in the 18th century, in radically different circumstances, this almost spontaneously, because of the capacity of individuals to start something new, you had manifestations of this revolutionary spirit, which he also wants to say were killed by professional revolutionaries. Let me read this paragraph. She's speaking now using the language of Shaw, that there was a treasure that came alive at this kind of moment that then almost disappeared and didn't even seem to have a name. And she said, what was this treasure? As they themselves understood it, it seems to have consisted, as it were, in two interconnected parts. They had discovered that he who joined the resistance found himself, that he ceased to be in the quiet of himself without mastery or naked unsatisfaction, that he no longer suspected himself of insincerity or being a carping suspicious actor, that he could afford to go naked. And in that nakedness, stripped of all mask of those whom society assigns to its members, as well as those of individual fabricates for himself in the psychological reactions to them, they had been visited for the first time in their lives by the appearance of freedom, their freedom. And she goes on to say, and this is the way in which she sees it breaking out over and over again, she says this: the men of the European resistance were neither the first nor the last to lose this treasure. The history of revolutions, from the summer of 1776 in Philadelphia and the summer of 1889 in Paris to the autumn of 1956, this brings us right up to Andrew, who, in her view, in Budapest, was politically, and this is a wonderful phrase, it's the spirit of revolution that politically spells the innermost story of the modern age, could be told as a parable from a form of a tale of an age-old treasure, which unexpectedly he appears and disappears again under different mysterious kinds of conditions, as though it were a fata morgana, that is a kind of illusion that one sees in the desert. There exist indeed many good reasons to believe that the treasure was never a kind of reality, a mirage, and that we deal here not with anything substantial, but an apparition. And that the best of the reasons is that the treasure thus far has remained nameless. And she now goes on, she sees that this appearance of freedom came about. I mean, she cites the Paris Commune, she cites the original Soviets, the actual Soviets, which were spontaneously organized workers' organizations and other organizations. She sees it in the Spartacus rebellion that took place in Germany. She even sees it in the early civil rights movement in the United States, where people sort of left their normal procedures, particularly in the phase of it which was nonviolent, and came together. I mean, sort of exemplified by things like we think of it as mainly as a kind of a movement of blacks and Martin Luther King, but there was an early period in which whites and blacks were working together in nonviolent ways in the Mississippi summer. And it appears, this thing, I mean, here's where Arendt is both, Arendt, I think, terms of optimism and pessimism, I think, don't apply to her. There's a kind of realism and at the same time an element of hope. I mean, she is a person who looks deeply into the darkness of our times, but sees always the possibility of a new beginning. Although you can't for her make a revolution, it occurs almost as for her as a kind of miracle. I don't want to go on. I've been going on for too long. Let me just end with this, and then there are a lot of issues to be raised that I have skipped over that you may want to ask. Is in the last chapter of On Revolution, which I hope that all of you someday will get to read, there she's struggling with a problem of whether it's possible to perpetuate what she takes to be so distinctive about the revolutionary spirit. And it's in that context that she speaks of the alternative, an alternative conception to the state as it now exists to the council system. So let me just read a couple of passages about that and then I'll end. Do we have any students of Andreas here? Leave us? I mean, in the last chapter of Andreas's book, his initial book on which is on Weber, Schmidt, and Arendt, he's got one of the most elegant descriptions of Arendt on the notion of the councils. I think it's something which he himself shares to a great extent. But let me just read with what she has to say. She runs through in the chapter once again all the times that she has seen this arise in the Paris Commune, in the original Soviets in Russia, in the February Revolution, even in the beginnings, in the years 1918-19, and she thinks it's right up to she thought that the spirit in that, remember the so-called Budapest Revolution or uprising is only 12 days. Andrew can speak about it, but what she saw in that is another exemplification where almost spontaneously people organize themselves into various kinds of councils, workers' councils, writers' councils, self-determining. It was not something that came about because of leadership. It was not something that because of a party plan. It just sort of emerged. So here's what she says. The mere enumeration of what I've just gone through of these dates suggests a continuity in a fact that never existed. It is precisely the absence of this tradition in an organized influence that makes the sameness of the phenomenon so very striking. And outstanding among the council's common characteristics, of course, is the spontaneity of their coming into being, because it clearly and freely contradicts the theoretical 20th century model of revolution, planned, prepared, and executed almost by cold scientific existences. It is true that wherever the revolution was not defeated and not followed by some sort of restoration of one-party dictatorship, that is, that the model of parliament of the professional revolutionary eventually prevailed, but it prevailed only after a violent struggle with the organs and the institutions of the revolution itself. The councils, moreover, were always organs of order as much as organs of action, and it was indeed their aspiration to lay down a new order that could be brought then into conduct and into the groups of professional revolutionaries who wish to degrade them into mere executive organs and revolutionary anxiety. And what was so important about them? It was the desire of direct participation of every citizen in public affairs of the country. And as long as they lasted, there is no doubt that every individual found his own sphere of action and could behold, as it were, with his own contribution to the day. And she goes on to describe what is distinctive. She sees as an alternative form the possibility of a council system that is ultimately modeled on a set of federations. Whether you consider this or utopian or not, here one can see, Arendt is sometimes considered a conservative kind of almost a kind of radical gesture of direct participation of the citizens in their councils, and then they would have sort of elect their other to higher councils, and so what you would have is not a nation state, but a kind of federation of councils. Towards the end of her life, she was asked, she had conducted an interview about this, and here's where I will end and then take up your questions. Forgive me for going on for so long. She said, and I think this is a very eloquent and moving way. It always makes me think of the origins of the Solidarity movement in Poland. She didn't live, remember, Arendt dies in 1975, but I think that she would have looked upon the beginnings of the Velvet Revolutions and the Solidarity movement as exemplifying her conception of the coming into the existence of the revolutionary spirit. But this is what she says about the councils. The councils say, we want to participate. We want to debate. We want to make our voices heard in public. And we want to have the possibility to determine the political course of our country. Since the country is too big for all of us to come together and determine our fate, we need a number of public spaces within it. The booth in which we deposit our ballots is unquestionably too small. But this booth has room for only one. The parties, she goes on to say, are unsuitable. There we are, most of us, nothing but manipulated electorate. But if only 10 of us, like the 10 of us here today, are sitting around a table, each expressing his opinion, each hearing the opinion of others, then a rational formation of opinion can take place through the exchange of opinions. There too, it will become clear which one of us is best suited to present our view before the next higher council, where in turn our view will be clarified through the influence of others, views revised and proved wrong. And then she says, by no means does every resident of the country need to be a member of such councils. Not everyone wants to be concern himself with public affairs. But in this affair, a self-selective elite would emerge. But anyone who is not interested in public affairs will simply have to be satisfied with it being decided without him. And here's the way she ends this interview. In this direction, I see the possibility of forming a new concept of the state, a council state of this sort, to which the principle of sovereignty would be wholly alien. It would be admirably suited to the federations of the most various kinds, especially because in it, power would be constituted horizontally and not vertically. But if you ask me now what the prospect has been for it being realized, then I must say to you, very slight indeed, after all. And then she ends the whole interview by saying, and yet perhaps after all, in the wake of the next revolution. Okay, so let me leave it there. I've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure that you have opinions and questions that you want to ask, but let Andrew speak.
I just want to make a few points. I mean, the first, it's quite interesting how right at the beginning you cited the line, which I also had in mind, namely that she thinks of socialism as a 19th century ideology along with others, and not very relevant. you could even say that of revolutionary socialism, which she is, of course, extremely aware of. So, of revolutionary socialism, what she wants to save is revolution. Socialism is a 19th century ideology, and she doesn't think of it as too relevant. And she's of course aware of regimes that call themselves socialist, and actually the origins of totalitarianism, a previous work,
Right.
focuses really on them. Socialism is not relevant because a new form of domination emerges, which actually links together Hitler's Germany with the Soviet Union and East European satellites. It's not socialism, whether you put socialism to the name, which I think in a way even the Nazis did. But you see, the problem of socialism is more serious for her because of the social question.
Right.
Now, of course, in a way, she doesn't have a text that I can think of where she says the socialists were preoccupied with the social question and they spent a lot of time thinking about how to solve it. In other words, how to abolish poverty, how to create greater equality, how to create systems of social protection for the citizen in the case of hardships and emergency and the crisis. She doesn't spend any time on it, but of course the social question includes all these things. It's a kind of quaint 19th century term for it, by the way, which I think you see in Tocqueville and others. It's not a term that the 20th century uses as much. It's her favorite term, and it really does include a socialist. And of course, her thesis is, as you so very, very well described, is that although revolution, the positive thing, is a political phenomenon, raising the social question destroys that phenomenon. It transforms it in such a way that the political goals, which are the proper goals, cannot be realized at all. Only in America, where the social question was only barely raised, did that not happen. So the social question or socialism is not only something obsolete, but actually it's a danger. It's a danger, it's a difficulty. It's a problem that difficult to solve unless you are situated in such a way that as the American free part of the population was in the 18th century, that you're not too troubled by poverty or very harsh levels of inequality and economic exploitation. So it really takes luck to avoid the social question. She kind of says, it wasn't raised in Hungary in 1956. In my mind, she gets lots of things about 56 wrong. For example, she insists they're not workers' councils, but citizens' councils. And they were workers' councils most emphatically. The uprising also had a military dimension, and they had councils, but the conciliar movement was in the factories for obvious reasons, because this was an ideology that the Soviets may actually accept as legitimate. But in any case, Hungary, the social question doesn't arise, she seems to imply, well, in too short a time, and I suspect it would have arisen because there were significant problems of economic and social hardship around. So she actually thinks the social question is a threat to
Absolutely.
To revolution and politics. Revolutionary politics must be freed from it. And so the theory she proposes, and it's interesting, I thought of Andreas Kalivas here too. There's a difference between Andreas and her, a significant one, which I will mention in a second. But at least initially, there is a great overlap because both attempt to reconceptualize the social question as a political question. I don't want to say democratic because she didn't like democracy as a category, Republican question, as a form of participatory democratic Republican question. And the whole form of socialism, or rather the whole form of revolutionary aspiration that she tries to reconceptualize in a place of socialism is political. Now, she knows that she has some relation to Marx and Lenin and even to Proudhon and Bakunin in this respect,
Right.
because the idea of the council was already there in them. But of
Right.
course, they all cared about the social question. She wants to radicalize the conciliar dimension that Marx picks up in 1871 at the time of the Paris Commune, which Lenin picks up in 1905 at the time of the February Revolution. That's the part she wants to radicalize, and she would like to marginalize the social question. I don't think it's entirely correct to say that she does not want to solve social questions.
No, that would be incorrect.
That would be incorrect. She implies that they are administrative questions ultimately.
Exactly.
And they would have to be solved by rational administration, but it would not be the political domain that would try to solve it, although the political domain would have to control the administration to be able to solve it. She doesn't, it's unfortunate that she doesn't go into that, because it makes her sometimes sound callous with respect to poverty and the poor. She wasn't, and she was familiar with those phenomena, but she doesn't think that that's the goal. And the great revolutions all had a moment when they actually try to solve even the social question ultimately in a political way. Because I was struck, I didn't remember it, and I always kind of remember the study as a contrast between the French and the American revolutions. The American is the political one, the French is the social question. The American creates a constitution. It does not institutionalize public freedom, but it does create a liberal constitutionalist constitution, which she thinks is a plus. She thinks it's a plus. The French doesn't even succeed doing that. So the contrast seems to be very grave between these two. But there are at least 7 or 8 pages on the sans-culotte, on the sections, on the clubs, on the revolutionary societies. So the French,
and she even mentions that positively at sometimes.
The French Revolution too, and in a kind of radical way. And they were compared to the American townships, poor people. They were poor people, or at least, you know, much poorer than any such organization in America. And they raised the question. Indeed, at one page she mentions their Republican organization, they're electing officers, they're creating a structure of participation and even leadership. And then she says, as if, of course, this is true for all the cases, that these enter into conflict with the revolutionary government, enter into a deep conflict with the revolution, and they do so on several points. One point is the point where she thinks the revolutionary government was probably right, is they want the end of poverty, and that cannot be done. Robespierre is more right about that than the Enragés or the Hébertistes.
Yeah.
But they are right against Robespierre on the 2 other points, and you talked about both of them. One of them is that they want to maintain their participatory organizations. Robespierre wants to make them instrumental for the Jacobin government. And they want to be federalists. They want to be federalists. That is, they think that a political institution, a constitutional structure based on their participatory model is possible, but only if you federate with other such organizations, other parts of France and all the rest. So on 2 points, the questions arise, the conflict arises, but the revolutionary government, and this is the tragedy of the whole history, only time the tragedy is not reached, as in the case of the Paris Commune, where the councils are defeated early, or the Hungarian uprising, where the Soviet intervention ends the process. But the implication is that the government or the party system or the dictatorship will defeat. I mean, in all these cases, it will defeat the councils. It's a tragic story she tells. There are really 3 revolutions in her story. One is the American, which succeeds in the creation of liberal institutions, constitutionalism. One is the French, which ends up with several dictatorships as its outcome. And then one is the revolution of the councils, which is tragic because it really has a normative. She didn't talk about, she wasn't a Kantian, so she didn't talk this particular language, but clearly she implies as a normative superiority over all the others. It's preferable. It serves freedom much better. It really influences Jefferson, for example, to go so far as to try to create some models by which this could be institutionalized. By the way, Condorcet did too, and she neglects him on that score, although she cites him on other points. But in any case, this is a tragic model because it is going to be, it's at most a treasure which we can recover. And each revolution recovers some of it, but it has not succeeded in the modern world. And it's not clear how it could succeed in establishing a political model. Now, it is meant to be a replacement for socialism in a way, in her theory. Radical democracy, she wouldn't.
You might say
is a replacement, but it's.
If I could just make a quick comment about that. I mean that some people might say, just playing it out in imagination. I mean, if it could work, that's what true socialism would be. It would be true socialism because it means everybody is participating at some level in self-determination. I mean, so you could make that kind of argument.
You could.
That's the way
of course, you might have some preconditions on the social level.
Yeah.
Because to participate on an equal level at this point, look at New York City even. I mean, it's just not the poorest place in the world. Can you imagine equal participation of every citizen of New York in local democratic structures? So some equalization would be necessary at the social level. And
that's why you have to.
Doesn't say, but I think it would be part of it. The sans-culottes, of course, were for that. And of course, every council movement. By the way, just let me end with this. She actually, we talked about this for Russia. In Russia, too, there are the councils which play a political role, but there was also workers' control, there are workers' councils. She's very skeptical about workers' councils being able to manage factories. That was our discussion yesterday with respect to Yugoslavia. I think that skepticism, too, is a little bit overdone. But in any case, her idea, I think we both agree on this, the replacement of socialism in the social sense is a radical form of democracy, a radical form of participatory republic. And it remains a viable idea for lots of people even today. So I'm done.
Make one quick comment before we open the discussion. I mean, I don't know. I mean, would be happy to share it with the class. A number of years ago, I wrote an article on the social and the political in Arendt, and this is what I would say. I think when you made the point that social issues have to be faced, but you didn't really deal with this in a detail, is a kind of fault. What I would say is this: I think sometimes she overdraws the distinction between the political and the social, and if you're going to take seriously what I just read, that politics isn't for everyone, but everyone has to have the opportunity, then you have to take seriously the social issue and the issue of material kinds of conditions. The one point I would say in her defense, so even though I think she overdraws it and I think she's wrong, she can be criticized, and I, even in Lively, when I knew her, criticized her on this issue, what can be said only that I would say in the defense is this. Let me just tell an anecdote. There's an exchange between her and Jaspers on another issue in our correspondence where he says gently to her, Hannah, I think you exaggerate. And she responds, exaggeration, you can't think without exaggerating. And I think there is a sense in which she is exaggerating what she wants to say because she thinks we've forgotten it. We've lost any sight, and our categories no longer even recognize that that's as anything. If we think of what politics is today and how we think about politics, she's absolutely right. So it's in a way a kind of recovery of a lost treasure, not just for nostalgia, but always because at least to hold out the vision that this is possible. Okay, but now we should open it up.
I had two questions for Professor Bernstein. They're both just clarifications. I think I didn't catch you quite, so I'm just going to request kind of that you repeat yourself.
Sure.
So the first question is, I just heard you say this, but didn't catch what it was. So you said the U.S. has been suffering from this disaster ever since. And what is that specific thing so that's my first question. Would you like to answer it, or should I share the second one as well?
Well, why don't I answer that first? I meant that Um, if you take, this almost euphoric description of the revolutionary spirit, I think that what her analysis of what's happened in America is it was lost, and we didn't have real. There were some vestiges of institutions. I mean, there are still places that have town meeting, but in terms of the spirit of creating something new and working together, that's what I think that she thinks is lost. And if we read her on contemporary politics, her contemporary politics, like what she thought lying in politics, I would recommend everybody to read her essay on truth in politics, because it could have been written about yesterday, and how you get the distortion of it. She thinks that we've lost a sense of what politics, she doesn't put it as what it was, but what it is to be it. That's the sense in which I think she's so critical of what's happened to it. And it's a very complicated issue. Someday, if I ever have the energy, I'd like to write an essay on Marx and Arendt, because even though officially she's very critical of Marx, there's a lot of Marx in Arendt. And there are ways in which I think she misreads. I think you could have a very interesting dialogue, because many of the things that Marx is ranting against in terms of what's happening in the 19th century, she herself is. I mean, she's no great fan of capitalism. So, but that's the main point I would make is it's the loss of the quintessence of what she takes to be action in politics, except in few moments that she thinks has been the story of America going downhill. Imagine a conversation in which I gave this lecture to Donald Trump. He wouldn't know what I was talking about. That's not his America, That's not what freedom is, all the things it is. So in a sense, it would be not simply, well, that's another interesting opinion. That makes no sense. And I think that would be true of a lot of people in the States now. So that's what I meant. Now your second question.
If I could make one just small comment, and I'm saying this not as a Trump supporter, but there is a perspective on Trump that he is enhancing a segment of the US population's participation in the political process, which has, as he likes to say, and we may believe that he is an opportunist for doing so, but as he likes to say, the forgotten people of America.
No, I mean, look, on the issue that Trump's success is that he was speaking to an element of the population that felt itself completely neglected, that I think is absolutely right. I mean, there's a sense for all the kind of professed liberalism of Clinton and Obama, they did not seriously address that issue. So that's the sense in which, I think when people think that everybody who's a supporter of Trump is stupid and dumb, that's really a dumb remark. That people were really suffering, and we had a political system that was not really speaking to them.
And this, of course, I didn't think of when the first 2 or 3 times I read this book. This is about the 4th time now. But reading this time, you see a very, very eloquent and strong critique of populism as a logic in it. And she keeps on returning to it, which is really extremely interesting. But we leave Trump to the side. And
I mean, she is, in some ways, you can take her as not just here, but in other places, as really a very radical critic of populism. Because populism is not politics,
Right.
It's not political freedom.
And indeed, she would say the social question is related to it. So in that sense, of course, it's not the only populism, left populism, social populism, but it is one possible variety. And she would say, well, the populist either exploits the social question.
Exactly. I mean,
goals that are not ultimately going to be satisfied, not the goals of those below. How many people of that constituency has Trump helped? We have 4 years now to judge it, and how many jobs did he restore in the Rust Belt? How many people has he lifted from poverty, or from how many persons' dignity has he managed to increase in some obvious ways? And you don't obviously this is part of the phenomenon. But you had another question.
Professor Bernstein, the second question. So you were quoting Arendt, and you said, and now I'm just using my notes, using the language of Shaw, she discusses a treasure that comes alive. What was this treasure? It was two interconnected parts. Could you delineate for me what those two parts were?
Let me say what comes to my mind. I can't remember exactly how I put it. Is this is the passages I were reading are from between past and future, where the exemplar that she's using for public freedom is the resistance, and the point is that a point that she's making is that here you had people before they joined the resistance with their ideological disputes and their own kinds of concern and their careerist concern, and now, to put it, the phenomenon of freedom came. And what did that mean? Because now they were acting together. There was nobody who was a kind of just leader of it. They were creating for themselves that kind of public space. That is certainly the thing. And then, of course, she thinks, and then I want to make another comment about this. She thinks that, ironically, when the war is over and there's no longer the need for resistance, they've lost something. They lost the treasure of freedom itself. Okay. I'm not answering. I can't remember the second part, but that's clearly one part of it. I do want to say something about this, which I think is extremely important in thinking and about Arendt itself. Is this: if we go back to a kind of liberal model, to say Isaiah Berlin's of two concepts of liberty, the suggestion is that liberty is always negative liberty. It's the freedom from, and that any attempt at positive freedom is on the slippery slope to totalitarianism. That is a common view. I mean, the whole leave me alone, the libertarian idea, get the government off my back and so forth. And if you're going to tell me what freedom should be, the end of that road is socialism in the bad sense, communism in the bad sense, totalitarianism. What I think is so distinctive about Arendt is that it's one of the most, in my opinion, eloquent and insightful understandings of positive freedom that has no overtones of totalitarianism. It's the response to that in it, so that the idea that a conception of positive freedom is going to lead down the road to awful things is here you have an example. And there's something else that I didn't get a full chance to operate. It's also a beautiful description of the phenomenon of what actually happens, how people feel in this. The one personal example I would give from my own experience, I was a participant in this early civil rights movement. When people go back and they think about that, I was in Mississippi in 1964, and people think of it as danger, and there were 3 people that were murdered, and what it leaves out? It leaves out the sense of joy, the sense that somehow you are now doing something, you're getting off your ass and doing something, and you're doing it with other kinds of people. So that phenomenology, that there's something sort of exciting and positive about this in its initial stages, I think is something that Arendt captures that I think few other people have captured.
Yes, no, the topic that I want to ask you about is this relationship again between the social question and the idea of politics that Arendt has, because nowadays the thing is that one of the main issues in the public discussion is the question on inequality. So the thing is that also it is very interested to take the ideas of Arendt to discuss the problem of the government, also related with the idea of with the institution of the governmental administration, but at the same time, one of the new issues for the political and public discussion is this of the economic, the social question. So,
right.
Could you talk more about this?
Yeah. Let me say something. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more, but Andrew, I'm going to send you my article on the social and political, and you can distribute it to them. But I will say this. Look, I said it earlier. I think that she overdraws the distinction. I think if we take her conception of politics seriously, sometimes she talks as if any dealing with economic issues and so forth, that's dealing with social issues, that's a matter of administration, and that's not really sort of political. There are passages that sound like that in it, and that I think is just overdrawn. I think what she should have said is that many issues have a kind of social dimension and a political dimension. The political dimension is that which is discussable and disputable. So, look, if you're interested in alleviating, say, inequality, you can't just have the will to do it. You have to understand something about economics and how one could do this. That requires an expert type of knowledge, that it requires, things. So there is a role for this, although there is a political issue. The political issue, okay, once you understand something about the economy, what kinds of measures should be taken to alleviate a radical kind of inequality? And that would be, so I would think that a better way of putting Arendt's point is this social dimensions and political dimensions of issues, but that you cannot avoid dealing with social issues in politics. You can't avoid that at all. That is a political issue, because the issue of debating and having different opinions about what's to be done, that fits the model for her politics, okay? So the short answer is there are, I think, passages in Arendt where it looks as if she's reifying a distinction which cannot be reified. On the other hand, as Andrew has tried to make clear, I think we can have a kind of a reading of why she's doing this and why she thinks that, trying to use political means to completely solve inequality and so forth can be dangerous and disastrous.
I just had a question on her use of the term irresistible, as she describes, a number of times, the revolution as an irresistible event. Yes. In the first chapter, she kind of explains why, I guess, where the term has come from, and it's got a kind of nomical? No, kind of like, right. Anyway, but she goes on to use it to describe the revolution, just even later. And I was just wondering about that.
Sure. No, this is an important question, which I did not really speak to directly, but it helps to explain it. That she does begin to talk about that dimension, and it deals with this theme. Arendt is enormously skeptical of any kinds of claims of historical necessity. And the idea that certain movements are there's a logic to history, there's a logic to development. So she thinks, when we speak about the irresistibility, she applies that mainly to the kind of French, that there are forces at work for it. For Arendt, and I think it's an unjustified, but this is even the way, one of the reasons she's so critical of Marx and Hegel. She reads Marx and Hegel as those elements in them that suggest there's a kind of historical necessity of things working themselves out. freedom for her is a break against, there is no historical necessity. There's always the possibility of new beginnings. That is quintessential for her, for action, for politics, etc. That, I mean, it goes back to what you might call her understanding of the human condition, that there is, to use her category of natality, that each of us are born and we can start something new. There's always the possibility of starting something new. And when you start something new, so that one of the things that she thinks has gone wrong in modern ideologies, we get seduced by the idea that there's a kind of necessity. So the irresistibility that she's talking about is, instead of seeing, like in the American way, that we together are creating this, and there was nothing sort of irresistible about it, what began to dominate the main tradition of European conceptions of revolution is that there are historical forces which are necessarily working themselves out. And if there's one thing that Arendt is always standing against, it's that. That goes, I mean, on all kinds of levels. I mean, sometimes she puts it that in terms of on a philosophical level. What did Marx and Hegel give us? They gave us a philosophy of history, but what we really need is a philosophy of freedom. So freedom is always something that breaks and starts something new. By the way, not to make her, and I mean, Arendt, Andrew was doing something to use the term tragic about, or the double faces. Arendt, one of her favorite words is perplexities. You're not going to find solution. Arendt did not believe that the task is to give blueprints of solutions. She wanted us to face what are the real perplexities. And one perplexity is how to adjudicate the social and the political in her. So that notion, which she takes over from, from the original revolution, the cosmological conception of necessity, she thinks it became dominant in the what I'll call the European tradition of the understanding of revolution as being, we think of, if you read Marx in the way that it's inevitable that there's going to be the proletarian revolution, that not only capitalism would destroy itself, but that the revolution must come, Arendt would say no to that, okay? So she's very critical of the notion of irresistibly, particularly as it's applied to history. I mean, this also even we would reflect back on her understanding of totalitarianism. There are some people who really want to argue that totalitarianism was only the result of modern enlightenment, or goes all the way back to, it was an inevitable outcome. And Arendt strongly insists that certain things could have been done, and if they had been done, they could have stopped totalitarianism. Let me just say something more about so you get the double-edgedness of Arendt, something new. For her, something new is not always a good thing. Totalitarianism for her was something radically new in it. So there's always that risk in new beginnings.
So Yana says, is the struggle circular or helical? Does it have direction, or is it a create and destroy kind of conundrum?
I just want to think of the right way of putting it. Arendt is suspicious of the concept of automatic progress as she sees of automatic doom. Those who, I mean, if you take the strand in the Enlightenment that thinks that there can only be ultimate progress and the triumph of reason which will affect social and political life, she thinks that's an illusion. But she's just as critical as those who think that inevitably everything is going downhill about it. Both of them are reflections of things. So it is, the emphasis for her is on rupture, on spontaneity, on break, on starting something new. And that's what she thinks happened in the various examples that she had, and they were unpredictable. She's not hesitant to use the word, although she doesn't really mean it in a religious sense. It's like a miracle. Why at a certain time does this begin to happen? You know, it's like a mirror. Retrospectively, you can give an analysis of the various kinds of causes, but in its happening, it's something which is an event which is distinctive and breaks the continuity of time. Okay.
But she explicitly discusses the issue of revolution as a circle. That's
Oh yes, yeah,
the
yeah,
old meaning.
yeah.
The glorious
Oh
revolution
no, that's when
still thought of it this way, and perhaps on the eve of the French Revolution, still this circular concept, but it is not. And it is the foundation of something new, although you may fail in founding that thing that you wanted to found. But it is something new. It's a constitution of a new, and in that sense, her idea of history is not circular, even though there are things that come back, but they come back in completely different and new ways.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot more I could say about the circularity, but I think what you just said is helpful and right, Andrew. We read Arendt and think about her in the same way, I think.
But she's probably very close. She's certainly against determinism, but determinism is not the same as linear conception, or at least a conception of history involving always new things. And so I think in that sense, she's neither circular nor deterministic.
No, that's true. Neither circular thing. And she does think that you have to face that she thinks those high points of revolutionary were significant events of freedom, you know, but she also emphasizes that totalitarianism was something which was unique and different and cannot be just considered forms of old tyranny and dictatorship. Yeah.
The new secular order, she likes that particular term.
Yes, she loves that. It's on every dollar bill. The novo secular thing, that's her thing. And that is a dominant theme, that's what was being created in and that's the idea that she, it's also a reason why she's against the idea of permanent revolution, because she thinks that in the real revolution, that the participants think of themselves as creating a new order, not something which is, just to be done over and over and over again. Constituting is, as you well know, Andrew, is so important for her, and constitutions.
But, just to continue that, it's not permanent it's not a permanent presence of the constituent power. You should constitute something. In other words, she's not against order. You should create a new order. But of course, along with Jefferson, she doesn't think that the creation of a new order should be the privilege of any one generation.
Right, exactly.
Creation of new orders is a historical possibility. And I think in that sense, emphasis is on the new, but not on the permanent.
I agree. Let me bring in something else here as a way of understanding at least the dilemma or the perplexity. Is it possible to perpetuate the revolutionary spirit?
Right.
I mean, without it being normalized. You could put it in a kind of Weberian perspective that inevitably it's got to be normalized, and therefore you cannot perpetuate something of that particular sort. That is, I read the last chapter as struggling with the issue. She's thinking it is possible. How can you perpetuate the revolutionary spirit without it inevitably being either destroyed or normalized, which is another way of destroying it?
Okay. Can I ask? I just have two issues I wanted to raise, Professor Bernstein. Thank you for your presentation. The first one, I was unable to follow exactly so she's certainly opposed to the political, the moment of revolution. If it starts to address the social question, it will necessarily lead to some kind of homogeneity and destroy plurality. And the other side of it was in her discussion between democracy and republicanism, the way she phrases it is that republicanism is precisely what allows for the separation of powers and as such maintains plurality, and therefore there's therefore democracy, which as I understood it was something about the unified, the Rousseauian construction of the general will.
Yes.
That's why she rejects it. But I wasn't able to quite follow how both of them are linked together, or if they are sort of necessarily related. And the second issue, it seems to me the tension between her notion of freedom and her hostility towards the social is really strong, at least in the last pages when she talks about the political elite, and that the elite are those who have, in some capacity, the will to both act and continue to act for in this free way.
Yeah.
And that elite is something that's different from the social or cultural elite, and in that they have the necessary capacities to engage in deed and speech. So if you could address both those questions.
Let me first speak about it's something that I did not go into in any great detail here. I don't think I even mentioned it. Arendt is very hostile to the notion of sovereignty. And she's hostile to what she thinks is the dominant trend in politics and political, where it's taken to be that the most important issue is who rules over whom. She even goes back to the ambiguity in terms of these terms, even in the Greek term of arcane. But get the strong contrast. Ruling over somebody, whether it be a monarch or even the people, is ultimately, she thinks, can lead to forms of violence. It's a critique she has of the notion of the will and the whole model of thinking that there is a sovereign that rules over the people, that is ruling over for her, is what mostly goes on in what we consider politics today, but for her is not really what politics is all about. You know, if you're particularly interested in this issue, I would suggest reading Jean Cohen's book on sovereignty, because she takes on Arendt's conception. She thinks that Arendt distorts the conception, that there are more positive conceptions of sovereignty. But sovereignty is one of the negative words, just like the general will. He has an interpretation of Rousseau here, which some might not consider a fair interpretation, where the whole notion of a general will is a disaster. It's a disaster because what it undermines is plurality. Without plurality, there is no real politics. And she even in her essay on violence, she says, you have the conception of that politics is really who rules over, and then the last logic of that step can be violence and terror. Now, I'm not saying that Arendt is correct in all this, but that is her view, her very deep skepticism about the role that sovereignty, ruling over the notion of the will, commanding, all of these notions come in for radical critique, because they're all opposed to a politics which is for her, maybe idealistically. She has this wonderful distinction. Politics is the politics of no rule. She distinguishes that from bureaucracy, which bureaucracy is the rule over where nobody is ruling whatsoever. So she's
the rule of nobody, she says.
The rule of nobody, that's what bureaucracy is. But no rule is what politics is about. And most politics, you might say, is traditionally conceived in political science, is who rules over whom, whether it's legitimate or not, where they get their authority from. All those questions for Arendt are not the right questions to ask about politics. Again, I want to relate it to the other point, because I think that I was making before, that I think that frequently Arendt overstates her case, but overstates it for a reason. And frequently the reason, in terms of what we're discussing today, is that we have lost understanding and insight into what was what is freedom and what is public freedom and what is, you might say, the dignity of politics. Okay, there was other questions.
Let me, if I could just say one thing on this point, because Udipta's question shows a kind of interesting ambivalence. On the one side, Arendt's favored model is democracy from below, or participatory democracy, or council democracy. On the other side, she's kind of attracted to the American separation of powers.
Yes, definitely.
She doesn't think that the American separation of powers is the right system because it has not left room for the fourth type of power from below. That's the boards of Jefferson, the councils. But she's supportive of that separation because she thinks that any kind of power that you would generate any which way also has to be checked. But she thinks liberal checks are not sufficient. You need power to check power. And in that sense, she's a federalist because that means that look at right now, just the conflict between New York State and the federal government. Very, very interesting, Cuomo and Trump. I mean, in a way, Trump cannot now do whatever he wants to do because he has the governors on his hands. And you can see how often he's forced to actually give in to that dimension. But there's also the court, which right now, you look at Wisconsin, is playing a bad role. It's not automatic that the role of one power will be good and the other power will be bad. Arendt basically thinks of that separation power system to be positive. And how that can be reconciled with the participatory model is a question she has not solved. She has not solved, but she's attracted, I think, by both. And Udipta was, I think, asking about that.
Yeah, let me just say something because this is, about this because it's another notion which we have not thematized. A distinctive way of understanding power. How do we normally think of power? We think of power over somebody, getting somebody, some group to do what we want it to do and do. That's not, I mean, she knows that that's all. She knows that that's realistic about what's really going on in the world. And let us never forget that she's the one who wrote a kind of, the most provocative book on totalitarianism. But power for her is closer to what we would speak about as empowerment. It is something that is created when people act together and it can grow and develop. It's not something it's something which is shared, not something which is vertical or over it. So one of the things that she thinks that was so interesting about the movement from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the federal government, was not limiting, creating a new power. That they consciously were creating a power of a federal government, and that's something that was necessary in terms of it. So power for her, in this sense of empowerment, is an absolutely positive term. And she says that some of her more dramatic moments, she will say that power only comes into being when people act together, and when they separate and go away, it disappears, it dissipates. So, yeah. And in a way, again, trying to apply this, I think that, it's interesting to see how in Velvet Revolutions and in the Solidarity movement, you see a certain Arendtian types of themes of how people sitting around, 10 people sitting around and the thing, how the movement grows and develops when more people feel empowered. So in dealing with, violence can destroy power, in the barrel of gum can destroy it. Power can ultimately undermine violence, for her too. And power as empowerment as it grows and develops. Yeah.
So, yeah, please.
Okay, I have 2 points or questions that I'll try to connect them. I hope that it's not too forced. But the first thing is we talked about the social question, and that's not the exact direction that I want to go. But I think one could make some broader conclusion from this whole idea of necessity taking over the cause of freedom, something about
Yes.
or the urgency, not only about poverty and social question, but in that logic of it goes against the cause of public freedom and the very idea of freedom that for her, I think, includes some aspects of time, actually, because compromise is there, the act of making compromises, the act of persuasion. So I'm wondering how much of the very modality of this change that comes in revolution itself is productive to the creation of those kind of exceptions or urgencies that to Arendt are end of politics. So basically how much the very way of movement of revolutionary change is actually make it less likely to create that to constitute the public freedom and not to get into that kind of permanent revolution that she talks about when she gets to French Revolution. And I think now this is the second point, that when she's talking about the American Revolution, one of the causes of success for her is that in that case you had this distinction between the sources of power and authority, that power, this act of people coming together and making decisions and acting together, is separated from the kind of stability that authority brings, that she sees in case of America to be invested in Supreme Court. So my question was, when we get to socialism and this idea of council, what would be, I mean, Andrew, when he was talking about how power would be something to restrict power, I was wondering what would be, because I was thinking of the Supreme Court and what would be the equivalent of that in not just establishing, but also maintaining those institutions of freedom.
Okay, let me just say something which is elicited in the first part of her remarks. For her, the arising of revolution is always exceptional. It's something completely unpredictable. It is, sometimes she uses it like it's an event that occurs. And as I mentioned to you, she would even say, you know, retrospectively, we can go back and we can talk about, for example, when she talks about the American Revolution, she now will say that we can see that there was a lot of experience historically in self-government, but why at a certain point it arose, and I think that there's something extraordinarily interesting when you study the history of what happened. I think the American Revolution, in her sense, would never have occurred if it was 10 years earlier or 10 years later. So there was a kind of distinctiveness, and it's in that. I mean, remember what I said at the beginning, that it's not only that the aim of revolution is freedom, but that's what's constitutive. I mean, revolutionary is a manifestation of the freedom that a public freedom that she's talking about.
That's exactly my question, that how much, I realize that she makes both points, but I wonder if there is a tension between the 2 points, that how much of this persuasion and making compromises and negotiation could actually happen in the process of revolution.
Well, she sees it not, compromise is not the word that she would use. She would use it as, much more as persuasion, in which we are now sharing opinions, testing them in public, you know, and on the basis that deciding of it. I mean, it involves a kind of compromise, but what she's much more interested in is the deliberative process that actually takes place when we're confronting each other as equals. And correctly or incorrectly, I mean, her claim is that this is what actually happened in, you know, at least the initial stages of the various examples, whether it be the Paris Commune or whether it be the original Soviets, that people came together without leadership, began discussing it, and collectively decided and treated each other as kinds of equals. So for her, it's actually manifested. I mean, that is what the revolutionary spirit is all about.
But her question is, if I can reinterpret it,
Yeah.
is that the councils, and distinct from below,
Yeah.
solves the issue of power
Yes.
in her statement, right? And then remains the question of authority. Now that question,
Yes.
you know, she solves it in a very strange way, because the Supreme Court, after all, is a creation of the process.
Right.
So authority cannot come from that.
Right.
So she has difficulties in actually showing where the authority comes from.
I think I didn't realize that's the question. I think that's.
And so I think that in that sense, the separation of power system added to the council system would provide a way of institutionalizing both power and authority, which would then mean, and this goes against the grain of what a lot of people think, that even if we had these beautiful democratic bodies, which you can see in Jefferson's wards or in Condorcet's direct democracy, they would not be all powerful. It's not all power to the Soviets. She mentions that slogan, all power to the Soviets, because it was something that helped Lenin win the revolution, or at least make the October Revolution. But she does not, her model is not all power to the councils. Her model is a model of separation and division within the councils would be there, but the Constitution would have to be enforced against every branch. And she's, in that sense, the stress on the Supreme Court, as weird as it sounds in our very present day in the United States, nevertheless is real for her, because she thinks that in some way someone has to enforce the system, and the authority of the system will come from the possibility of that enforcement. So power is one thing, authority is another. And
I would put it, I mean, I now see the point.
Yeah.
And I think that she really is ambivalent on the notion of authority.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes she's using it as, you know, the authority of tradition, and that she's critical of. But in terms of authority within, you know, a political system is something which I really think she doesn't, I mean, she does cite something about the Supreme Court, but it really, I think, is not deeply thought out myself. So I think there is a tension.
And there is still a chicken and egg question, which I try to solve by saying that the actual method, because she says something like the principle is in the action itself, by which she means that if you had a democratic process of generating or a participatory process, it would lend the outcome authority. But it's not thought out. No, I completely agree.
I think that that's right. I mean, you know, I think there are a whole series of issues. If she really is suggesting that the council system is a viable alternative about authority, about power, about separation of power, where I don't think you're going to find, I mean, it's all sketchy in that respect.
It's a sketch.
Yeah.
Again, in relationship to our discussion on socialism, the thing that I think that the most radical thing that we can get from the reading of Arendt is this notion, this normative notion on politics related with the self-government or the participatory component of the politics, and also related to the idea of the public sphere and the distinction between politics and violence that she mentioned in the introduction. And she has a nice quotation about that, because she mentioned that where it's in summary, it's something like where violence rules, there is a totally silent. And also she mentioned this violence in relationship to the experience of the concentration camps and the idea of the totalitarian regimes. So the thing is that, do you think, both of you, Professor Andrew and Professor Bernstein, that one of the most necessary normative components that the socialist project needs today, it's to pay attention in a more bigger way, I don't know how to say this, to this idea of the participatory claims regarding to the experiences of the councils.
Yeah, I see. Let me give my own answer. We're coming to an end here. I sometimes think that the most interesting way of reading Arendt is A, to see the real perplexities that she's elucidating for us. And the second is really as a kind of, not necessarily as a blueprint. I mean, I don't really think that she really thought out the whole idea of the councils, but as a kind of basis, you want to use the language of critique of what's going on. And if we come back to your issue of socialism, you see, I think that Arendt, you know, it's frequently said that the way in which real communism interpreted Marx was really a distortion of what Marx is really all about. What I think is a little bit naive about that is what doesn't really appreciate those elements in Marx that could lead to something like Stalinism. And I think that one of the, clearly, we can see this in the debate between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, that the idea that any adequate, whether we're going to call it communism or socialism, has to have a real place for what she's talking about as politics, where there is real plurality, where there is the expression of scientific, different kinds of differences, so that I think ironically that you could say that one of the aspirations of socialism is to make manifest the kind of public freedom that Arendt is talking about. And one of the failures of really existing socialism and communism is that it had no real place for this. I mean, once the dominance of the party dictating in what is to be done, then you're on the way to some type of form of totalitarianism. So I think that Arendt is right in being critical that this element, that freedom doesn't just grow out of necessity. It involves a whole lot more. And if you're going to develop an adequate the idea of socialism in our time, somehow at least the positive elements of what she's talking about have to be incorporated.
I think it's pretty much time, and we have to let you go. Really was very, very good presentation, an excellent discussion. I think the students really enjoyed it. We had a good number. We had 14 at one point, and that's really good. Thank you very much.
So I enjoyed it. Okay.